I come from Belgium, so the country right above, and the Flemish part. So, what was I going to talk about in 15 minutes? And I just picked a title, a random title, A Night at the Museum. And there have been times where I regretted picking this title, basically. But, I mean, once you pick something, I kind of want to stick to to what I've picked, basically, because you can't change your mind the whole time. And tonight's story is a lift and shift story. And for those of you that don't know what that is, I basically pick something, a true story that happened to me on one of my journeys, and put it in a fake domain, thereby protecting both myself and any parties involved, basically. So, Night at the Museum. Now, the problem is, if you do a lift and shift story, there's going to be some loss in translation, meaning that some of the weight that you put into your story is not going to come across as good. But still, it's an experiment, so I'm going to try it anyway. So, I think a couple of years ago, a friend of mine was working for Cluzo Software. And what Cluzo Software does, it builds software for museums. And specifically, they had a focus on security officers, basically, that would report incidents, things like that. Now, my dad had been a security officer for most of his life, so I kind of had somebody to relate to, basically, about the domain. So I really loved that I could basically relate to the stories he'd bring home at night, basically, and then work on a project that was similar to that. Now, Cluzo Software was a very welcoming company to me. It was, frankly, the first time I entered a company that was so open and so frank. I think the first week I was there, I talked to people from sales, I talked to people from product, R&D, development, and I kind of got to know the people that work there. Who are they? What are they trying to achieve? How are they contributing to the overall goal, basically, of what Cluzo is doing? What are the things they don't like about the company, where they're going? And how do we excel, basically, compared to our competitors, for example? It was an interesting thing. And you get to know, in a very short period of time, when you do it in this kind of interviewing, you get to know a company, basically, very quickly. Now, there was one thing that was striking me as odd, because, well, I should first say, basically, they've been hard at work building their own big ball of mud, basically, right? Any startup, and you can't blame them. A lot of companies start out this way. But as I was saying, when I talked to sales, I saw something that, or I heard something that tripped me up, basically. And for clarity, the snake is sales, right? So, and they kind of tried to put a spell on me. And they said, Yves, our software is so great. And I said, why? Well, you know what? When we go into a sales presentation or a tender, basically, we're able to cater for so many of the requirements that customers have. I said, well, why is that? Well, they want extra fields. They want customized workflow. And already the red bulb in my head started to go on there. And it's such a great product. Now, I moved on, basically, and I said, well, let's talk to the developers, basically. And these are the code monkeys doing the coding work. And, they talked at length about how long it actually took to implement the feature. And they talked about their Danse Macabre, which was their Git rebase ritual, which would take like half a day to get something in. And then they didn't even talk about the fact how long it took for somebody new that would come on, basically, to become productive. We were talking about months, basically. They were also walking a minefield of abstractions, so it kind of relates to the previous talk in that regard, I would say. And finally, I get to talk to the chief architect. And he was so infatuated with all the abstractions he created. But it was also, at the same time, a very sad story, because this was a kind of story where business or the higher level management had been leaning on him basically to get in the features that that they wanted, to get in the flexibility that they wanted. And ultimately, what suffered? The software design, basically. So here I was, in this jungle where, I mean, I was surrounded by a lot of domain knowledge because they had a lot of ex-security officers working for them and doing their training. But I was thinking, what am I doing here? How am I going to contribute? Am I really going to step into this whole big ball of mud? And the thing was, I got lucky. Because I got put on the Greenfield project right next to the Brownfield project. That doesn't solve the problem, though, right? But in any case, I mean, I got a new adventure there, and I thought, well, let's stick around and see where this goes. So, one of the things that I noticed, both in their attitude and their code base, was the fact that inertia was kind of the enemy to whatever they were doing, and especially a model, to my knowledge. Now, inertia means that you resist change. And I can give you an example of that. Historically, they've been selling basically to small museums. And why? Well, it was easier. They didn't have the feature set to sell to the bigger museums. Now, this is the Margriet Museum in Brussels. It's not that big. It's one building. How many security officers will work here? Take a wild guess. Sorry? 20 and 100 is a lot. I mean, my average was 5. Basically, and then I said, well, let's make it 10, and then to account for the fact that these people probably work in shifts, and some of do CCTV, and others do other things, let's say 20. So that was a reasonable size, I would say, right? Now, the software, what it would allow them to do, it would help them basically report incidents into the system, and they would have to report where that incident happened. And for this kind of small museum, they had built in, deep down into the bowels of whatever object model this was, there was a museum, and the museum was decomposed into sections, where a section could be a floor, it could be a room, it could be part of a room, I don't know. And this was the model they've come up with. It's a nice, simple model. It's a structural model. Now, the thing was that now that their feature set was growing, they got the attention of the bigger museums. And I don't need to introduce this one, do I? It's the Louvre, right? How big is this? 72,000 square meters of exhibition space. How many security officers do you think work here? Exactly. I looked it up on the website. So they have 2,000 people on staff, and half of that is on security. So that's a hell of a lot more people, basically, to support. And then the sales reps were coming in with their abstraction that we had built up until that moment to try and squeeze, basically, the Louvre, which was wings and floors and all these extra spaces, into this museum and sections. And you kind of could see on the traffic on email going back between Louvre and and the sales guys that Louvre wasn't too impressed with what we had there. And there was an additional wrinkle to this, which was the Louvre, well, it's not only in Paris, it's in Lens and it's in Abu Dhabi as well. And they wanted one software installment, basically, for all of that. And now we were in real trouble, basically. Meanwhile, me and the guys working on the Greenfield project, we've been listening into this conversation. And we heard many stories like these. And what we came up with was this. Well, we said, let's make this museum exhibit area layout problem a separate problem. We were doing incident management software. We weren't doing how to lay out basically how a museum was decomposed into areas. We weren't solving that problem. We were solving a different problem. But we needed this. We wouldn't be shipping our software without this. So this was our necessary evil bounded context, basically, that we invented. Now you may say, well, Yves, I'm sorry, but I'm not that impressed with your model. I mean, okay, you got an organization, you got now multiple sites, and then you have some hierarchical structure with sections. But you're missing the point. The point is that conversations we would now be having would have never happened had we sticked with the old model. And this was really crucial for us, basically. Because now people started looking at what we were doing, and they started paying attention, and now this opened up the opportunity to replace something maybe in their monolith. Now, inertia is also a role's enemy. So it's not just a model's enemy. So on the left you have the product owner, which I didn't like. On the right you have me playing the role of a software developer. Now the reason I didn't like the product owner is because basically he was not on a personal level, but a project manager that got put into the role of a product owner. And so one of the days on our Greenfield project, we'd have this conversation, and it would go something like this. Hey, Yves, here are the requirements describing how an incident works. And how an incident works would mean, well, here's the life cycle or workflow that's related to how we deal with incident. And he gave me a 10-page document, basically, in a rather small font. And I went, that's a lot of text there. I start reading the text. So, mind you, we didn't have a conversation there. I was reading text. And I went through it. It didn't feel right. But if you're in my position, you're in a domain where you don't feel particularly strong about what it should be. It might be the wrong decision to go battle someone that you don't have the ammunition to battle. So I said, well, this seems awfully complicated. Are you sure this is what you want? To which the response obviously was, well, of course, this is what the customer wants. What to do? So I said, well, what if I try to visualize these requirements you have, basically? I'm having a hard time basically understanding all this text, basically, that you gave me. Well, sure, if that helps. And then I started out, basically, and I started drawing activity diagrams. And I drew a lot of, it's pixelated and it's on purposely pixelated. And I started drawing lots and lots and lots of these. And I wasn't really content because the permutations was skyrocketing, basically. So I was looking for, well, this is life cycle, this is workflowy type of thing. So I started drawing simple state charts, basically, to get to grips with a problem. The objective was not a diagram. The objective was to understand the problem, basically. And then after a lot of drawing, I designed some of these monsters. And I don't think it's going through very well, but let's just say it's very, very big. And I was literally well-versed in traversing these. I could tell the stories that were hidden in the requirements, basically, by traversing the state chart. I knew I could explain them to the product owner. But I could also start spotting the contradictions. I could traverse it and I could say, well, here you're saying this, but then if we travel it another way, you're saying something totally different. And he became uncomfortable when I said things like that. So I thought, well, maybe I need to tackle it a different way. I said, you know what? At our next meeting, you mind inviting some of our trainers, which were ex-security officers, basically? And he said, sure, but why? Well, I'd like you to explain the monsters I've created, basically, and explain it to them. Because if you're not going to be able to explain it to them, how are we going to be able to explain it to other end users in the field? So this was, again, another kind of inertia. There was somebody who was holding on to something he shouldn't be holding on to. And it was me in a position not able to fight that, at least not in the beginning, but I was able to do that over time in a non-violent way, where we would start cooperating more often, basically. So I got a more healthy relationship with this person, where I got things done. So bottom line, challenge inertia. Thank you.